Gentleman from Florida, Mr. DeSantis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for having this hearing. I'm sure this is going to be a subject that's going to have a recurring importance given the huge expansion of the authority of the IRS under the so-called Affordable Care Act. I heard some of the colleagues on the other side of the aisle almost just mocking the hearing, and it really struck me because it's almost as if somehow we're just not supposed to talk about Obamacare anymore. And I think as we've seen it become implemented, the more and more apparent it's been that the promises that were made to justify the law's passage are essentially null and void. They were essentially false pretenses. I mean, for example, the president said the only change for people with insurance is that you will pay less, and that estimate was $2,500 per family. That, Americans are finding out, is totally not going to be the case. If you like your plan, we were told you can keep your plan, but yet we see stories of spouses losing their coverage, employees losing their employer-based coverage, getting put on the exchanges. And then we said, if you like your doctor, you get to keep your doctor. But if you lose your current plan, you end up on the exchanges. You may not have access to the same doctor that you did before. And so the issue is not going to go away, given that what was promised is not being delivered. I think it's also just interesting to compare the passage of the health care law with some other major pieces of legislation. I just looked this up. It's amazing. Social Security got 96% of Democrats in the House, 81% of Republicans. Eisenhower's interstate highway system got 93% of Democrats in the House, 98% of Republicans. Civil Rights Act 1964, 61% of Democrats in the House and 80% of Republicans in the House. Reaganomics 1981, 78% of Democrats in the Senate supported that, 98% of Republicans. And even welfare reform in 96, broad bipartisan agreement. You didn't have any bipartisan agreement here. And so I think that also contributes to the controversy. I keep hearing that this is the law of the land, as if it's somehow sacrosanct, that you can't actually advance legislative changes to it. And that just, we have the authority to do that. Of course we're able to suggest changes, delays, repeals, whatever is in our Article 1 authority. But the thing about this notion that somehow it's the law, full stop, you can't even talk about it, is if this is such a sacred piece of legislation, then why isn't the president implementing it as written? I mean, we've talked today about the delay in the employer mandate, which was supposed to start in January with no statutory basis for the delay. We know that there was a delay on the cap on out-of-pocket costs, which were supposed to take effect this year. We know subsidies were granted to members of Congress without having a statutory basis. Income verification requirements for exchange subsidies suspended, and then the use of subsidies on these federal-based exchanges. And that's what I want to talk about now, just in terms of whether this implementation is being done with the law. The law under the Affordable Care Act says, Section 1401, subsidies can go to an individual, quote, enrolled in through an exchange established by the state under Section 1311 of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. Of course, we've seen most states have rejected creating exchanges as the law contemplated, and so then the IRS has had to determine, well, what about these federal exchanges? And I don't see any statutory basis for those subsidies to flow to federal exchanges. Nevertheless, on May 23rd, 2012, the IRS finalized a regulation which actually allows subsidies to flow to federal exchanges, even though there's no provision in the law to allow that. So my question for you is just, were you consulted when they were devising this rule about whether the IRS should issue guidance allowing to flow to people who were enrolled in federally run exchanges instead of exchanges instituted under Section 1311?
I was present for a number of different topics that were covered by that reg. For that particular topic, I was not particularly involved. I was probably in a briefing or two where other people discussed it, but it wasn't my decision.
So they weren't asking you your thoughts about whether you thought that these subsidies should flow to people in federally run exchanges?
I'm about administrability, not about the legal policy calls.
Now, were you, prior to this regulation being instituted, were you guys going forward with your implementation assuming that the subsidies would be available for the states that declined to create a state exchange?
The proposed regs included the same position. and there were many comments that were filed, as is always the case after proposed regs. It's part of my job to keep track of what's in the proposed reg stage, ask about whether what's coming in comments and the likelihood that something would change so that we don't go too far in implementation steps if something is going to change and we would have to change our work. That's my role.
But so the answer, though, is yes, you guys had assumed that there would be federal subsidies for federally run exchanges?
I kept track of the likelihood that the position in the proposed reg would change so I could adjust, if necessary, the administrative work.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I think the gentleman brings up a